And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, January 12th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, in a crowded federal contracting space, Hive Group bets on innovation. Plus, the president's PMA push to deliver results and buy American meets a thicket of rules that contractors can't afford to misread. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The IRS is just weeks away from the start of a busier than usual filing season, but a group of senators is warning that the agency may be stretched too thin to respond to taxpayers' needs. The agency lost about a quarter of its workforce last year and is embarking on a major shakeup of its IT operations. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more details. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry.
Let's just check everybody's calendar. When does filing season start this year?
Yeah, so mark your calendars. It's going to start on Monday, January 26th, so a matter of weeks from now. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's typically in line with when the filing season usually begins, but if you took the word of former IRS Commissioner Billy Long, during his brief tenure at the agency, he said that the filing season this year was going to start in mid-February, giving the IRS workforce more time to prepare for what will be a busier than usual filing season, and that's all to do with new provisions stemming from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that became law last year. It's going to create a lot more work for the IRS to update forms and make sure its IT systems are compliant with the tax provisions that are in that bill.
We started talking about that problem actually when the bill passed, about all of the work that IRS was going to have to do to get this season ready, given all the changes in the rules. What concerns do lawmakers have about IRS's preparation for this upcoming filing season?
So just before the holidays late last year, a group of senators, led by Senators Elizabeth Warren and Angus King, they are asking the IRS what exactly they've been doing to prepare for this busier than usual filing season, especially given the fact that the IRS has a lot fewer employees than it did beginning in 2025, that they have seen about a quarter of its workforce leave largely through voluntary separation incentives and retirements, and they have not really done much to backfill those roles. And also pointing out the fact that the IRS had no fewer than 7 acting IRS commissioners last year, just a reflecting of no one really being at the helm of this agency for a significant period of time. And now the IRS is embarking on its biggest task of the year, the filing season.
And they still don't have a confirmed commissioner. Frank Bisignano from Social Security Administration is still overseeing the IRS, right?
That's another curious thing. Bisignano is the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer for the IRS, a brand new role. There's never been one of those before. Seemingly overseeing the day-to-day operations of the IRS while simultaneously overseeing the Social Security Administration. And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is at this point the acting IRS Commissioner. So it's not really clear where the responsibilities for one role begin and the responsibilities for another role end.
The IRS's internal IG has been looking at this, right? What have they got to say about how prepared IRS is for the season?
Right. So a Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration report recently found that these staffing cuts will more likely than not make it more difficult for the IRS to detect fraud, to process tax returns, and to provide tax help to people over the phone or in person at its taxpayer assistance centers. And the National Taxpayer Advocate, Erin Collins, last summer came to a lot of the same conclusions. She said that last year's filing season was largely successful because a lot of those cuts had yet to materialize during that period of time. But this filing season is going to be a different story, that there's just not enough employees at the agency to cover all of its responsibilities and to man the phones and to ensure that taxpayers have the level of service that they have come to expect from the agency.
Has the IRS publicly stated anything about how prepared it is or how it is preparing?
So there was some hiring that went on last year to account for especially the phone service side of the agency, although not as many employees have been hired as the IRS said in its fiscal 2026 budget requests. In that document, they said that they would need to hire about 11,000 employees to maintain their current level of phone service. And if they weren't able to do that, then the level of phone service would really depreciate to a significant level here. What the IRS was able to do is they put out hiring notices to fill about 4,500 full-time contact service representative jobs, but they quickly pulled those positions down, and then they had a different hiring announcement for about 2,000 positions that are seasonal hires. So they can only stick around at the agency for up to 4 years, that they can get those seasonal jobs renewed for up to 4 years, but they wouldn't be full-time career positions at the agency. So again, there's a significant shrinkage of the IRS workforce, and perhaps a sign of where things stand in terms of operations for the agency. They did stay open the days before and after Christmas, even though President Donald Trump gave many federal employees those days off. There are, of course, caveats to that executive order that allowed agencies to stay open if they had a mission-critical need to do so, and the IRS said, all right, any volunteers will offer you holiday pay if you decide to stick around and continue working.
Joy, you're talking predominantly here about customer-facing folks. What about the back office side, especially the IT workforce? So much of IRS's work hinges on ancient information technology.
Yeah, some of the oldest running IT systems in the federal government reside at the IRS, and it takes a team of thousands to keep those systems running 24/7, 365. And there's been a major shakeup of the IRS IT organization at this time, where it's really the 11th hour for them getting everything ready. The IRS recently moved about 1,000 of its IT employees out of its tech shop as part of this reorganization that's been in the works for a matter of months. And there's a lot of questions surrounding this still. The reassigned employees, I've spoken to a number of them. They've been given really few details on what work they'll be doing next. They've been told that they will no longer be working on IRS IT projects. The reorganization went into effect at the end of last month, and employees in the coming days here are really trying to wind down projects. They're trying to tie up loose ends, to hand off work to colleagues of theirs who will remain in IRS IT. And for the time being, these reassigned employees will report to the chief operating officer. Although one other wrinkle here is memos that these employees have received. They've been told that COO reporting structure is only temporary, and that they've actually been told to send in their resumes, their most updated resumes, to the CHICO, the Chief Human Capital Officer, and to see if there's a job anywhere within IRS or Treasury that they would be a good fit to take on.
This sounds like those of us who are planning on a tax rebate might want to have a longer window before we expect to receive that.
That's probably a good idea.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story on federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the president's PMA push to deliver results and buy American meets a thicket of rules that contractors can't afford to misread. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Consumer Made in the USA claims require products to be all or virtually all U.S. made, while federal procurement uses different and tightening domestic content tests under the Buy America Act and the Berry Amendment. That complexity is colliding with the president's new PMA goal to deliver results and buy American. It raises the stakes for verification, disclosure, and enforcement. Here to set out what contractors must do to stay compliant is counsel at Reed Smith and former FTC Made in USA program manager, Julia Enzer. Ms. Enzer, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You know, our timing on this topic is pretty lucky since the president's management agenda just dropped. One of its 3 goals is to deliver results and buy American. It specifically has an objective to rebuild American industry through prioritizing and enhancing Made in America execution. But right there we see a conflict. One is Buy American and the other is Made in America. And you're an expert in this space. Talk to us about the difference between those two concepts and what makes it so confusing.
Yeah, that's a great question and one that I've heard many times. So when we're talking about Buy American, we're generally talking about federal procurement. We're talking about if government is the buyer and you're supplying goods to the government in accordance with a contract, there are very, very specific requirements that you have to fulfill in order to be Buy American compliant. When we talk about Made in America or Made in the USA, in general, we're talking about an advertising claim. We're talking about how you position your product, how you market your product to consumers. So the standard for making a Made in the USA or Made in America claim, it's very different. It's tagged to how reasonable consumers understand your claim, and it's aimed at preventing consumers from being misled. Completely different from the very formulaic requirements of responding to a government contract for Buy American purposes.
Could you give us an example of a product that might meet one requirement, for example, Buy America, but not Made in the USA, or vice versa?
Yeah, so when we talk about Made in USA as a marketing claim, in general, the Federal Trade Commission is going to expect products to be all or virtually all made in the USA, all the way back to raw materials. So that means to advertise a product to consumers without misleading them, your product needs to have no more than de minimis foreign content in it. That's very different from a product that could be supplied to the government in response to a contract that is covered by Buy American, where you can have a fairly significant proportion of the product attributable to foreign costs. So under Buy American, you only need about 65% of a manufactured product's cost to be attributable to U.S. costs. So it's different from the all or virtually all standard.
You mentioned that 65% threshold. Under the Buy America Act, that content threshold is going up to 75% in 2029. Does that change compliance strategies for contractors?
It'll mean that everybody needs to continue to review their supply chains. So you need to be in continuous contact with your suppliers. You need to be understanding where all of your components are coming from and monitoring to make sure that you are ready to meet that 75% when it snaps into place if you're supplying products to the federal government.
Supply chains have been under such pressure since the pandemic and continue to be shifted and realigned. Do you think that suppliers and supply chains are ready for that shift?
That's a great question. I think that because supply chains are so constantly in flux, certainly when I was at the Federal Trade Commission, we saw problems arising from this all the time. I think it's incredibly difficult for marketers, for suppliers to stay on top of what's going on. That's why it's so important to have open lines of communication, to have procedures in place for routine audits, for routine certifications that you're seeking from your suppliers, to really understand where every part of your supply chain is and what's going on.
I'm speaking with Julia Enzer. She's counsel at Reed Smith and former Made in the USA program manager for the Federal Trade Commission. We talked about Buy America and we talked about Made in the USA. In the Defense Department, there's the Berry Amendment that plays a role in these kinds of considerations as well. Talk to us about how that fits into this picture.
Yeah, so if you are supplying to the Department of Defense, the standard that you have to meet is even higher when it comes to certain products like food, clothing, fabric, specialty metals. In the case of those products, if you're supplying to defense, your products must contain exclusively U.S. content. So that means that a product that could be compliant with Buy American, that could very potentially not be sufficient under the Berry Amendment.
So contracting officers have a lot to watch out for here, as do suppliers. You've warned that sourcing changes can trigger compliance problems. And so what should companies be proactively disclosing? What should contracting officers be sure they're asking to make sure that everybody is on the right side of these laws?
Right. So you need to be going back and talking to every person in that supply chain Make sure that your suppliers are providing reliable certifications and that they have all appropriate documentation of where components are coming from, that they understand early inputs to the manufacturing process, which is where problems can occur. And then have a process in place to communicate routine supply chain changes. Don't just restrict this to annual review. Make it a term of your contract with your suppliers. Require them to notify you as soon as possible if something changes, so you in turn know whether you need to talk to your contracting officer, whether you need to make supply chain changes to bring your products into conformance.
Sometimes, in spite of everybody's best efforts, there are mistakes. Are there any safe harbors, little loopholes for places where they report 70%, but it's 65% or something like that?
So I don't know about loopholes per se, but open lines of communication are always the best policy. Make sure that you are reporting issues. Don't wait for an insider to report an issue to the government. Significant penalties can be on the line if you make mistakes in this area. So have open lines of communication. Be just talking when changes happen so that you can remediate issues as they occur.
You mentioned significant penalties. What actually could happen if a company is in violation of any of these laws or restrictions?
Right. So the government can sue you directly. You can be liable for significant penalties under the False Claims Act. And then the False Claims Act also allows whistleblowers to file confidential lawsuits on the government's behalf and receive a percentage of any resulting recovery. So that means that if there's an insider who sees your issue, those insiders are incentivized to let the government know if compliance falls through the cracks. So potentially significant penalties on the line.
How common are those whistleblower cases?
Fairly common and increasingly common.
And what kind of incentive are we talking about here?
It's a percentage of the recovery, and recovery could be in the millions.
Wow. So everybody really does need to pay pretty close attention. Certainly, given your experience here, if you could rewrite the rules, are there things that would make compliance clearer or maybe disentangle some of the rules that seem to be conflicting?
So certainly consistency across the board would make it a lot easier for everyone. I mean, right now you have a system where marketers and contractors are having to comply with so many different standards, so many different laws, and it makes it really, really challenging. And marketers that think that they're doing their best, that know that they're, for example, compliant with Buy American and want to go out and tell that story about their U.S. manufacturing to consumers, can find themselves in trouble with the FTC, can find themselves the subject of a consumer protection action. And that's a real challenge. So if there were an opportunity to harmonize the rules and the regs, it certainly would make things better for marketers. On the other hand, that could lead to additional consumer confusion or deception. So it's a really hard place to be. And to some extent, that tangled regulatory web is somewhat necessary to harmonize the joint goals. You have the government and the administration on the one hand wanting to prioritize buying American goods, wanting to incentivize marketers to reshore manufacturing. And on the other hand, you have a push and pull with consumer protection authorities whose job is to make sure that line consumers are not being deceived or misled by claims. So while it would be great if there were some harmony across the board, while it would be very helpful to marketers and to businesses, there's also some tension here in the competing goals that the different laws and regulations are on the books to serve.
Do you see any interest or momentum in Congress or amongst the regulatory community to actually move towards that kind of streamlining or simplification?
So over the years, I've seen movement in all directions. And the problem is that there are really strong arguments for harmonization. You know, it's helpful to business, may result in reshoring of more jobs and encouraging more U.S. manufacturing. But on the other hand, when you look at consumers, when consumers see claims that products are made in USA, they have really high expectations for what that means. They expect that the thing that they pick up is all or virtually all, is no more than de minimis foreign content. And so On the one hand, while there is a great argument toward streamlining and fostering the development of U.S. manufacturing, it's so important to make sure that consumers are getting the product that they bargained for. So for now, the best balance that I think that we've been able to strike is, on the one hand, having those technical requirements in place on the procurement level to help businesses and manufacturing on the margin where we can there, but at the same time recognizing that when you're marketing to consumers, we have to protect consumers and impose that higher standard. So that's really tricky for marketers, for businesses, but at the moment, it may be the best we can do.
Well, it sounds like everybody needs to remain vigilant until we sort out the complexity, but it'll also be interesting to see how this plays into the president's management agenda.
Absolutely.
I've been speaking with Julia Enzer. She's counsel at Reed Smith and former Made in the USA program manager for the Federal Trade Commission. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the House clears a key spending package and ACA subsidy extensions. We'll look at what happens next with Mitchell Miller. But first, in a crowded federal contracting space, Hive Group bets on innovation. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Federal agencies face mounting pressure to modernize without sacrificing security or compliance. Will Fortier, CEO of Hive Group, joins us to discuss the technology and process innovations driving mission value, the critical decisions behind Hive's growth, and what the next 5 years look like for federal contracting in this episode of Government Contractors to Watch, sponsored by J.P. Morgan Chase. Well, it's so great to have you.
Thanks for having me on, Terry.
Let's start with talking about Hive. You've positioned yourself really as a disruptor in the federal contracting space. Are there specific technology or process innovations that have helped you most transform your organization?
Well, I think that that's something that every organization is going through at this moment in time. I think some of the enablers that we've certainly benefited from would be the cloud service providers. That has completely revolutionized how we interact with our solutions. When I entered the GovCon space, we were still on print and file servers, and version control was a huge issue, and just moving towards collaborative tools like Google Suites and Microsoft Teams has allowed us to actually collaborate on the artifacts that we're building for our clients and communicate. I mean, could you imagine going through a pandemic without those cloud service providers? I mean, that has been a big game changer for us in how we affect our clients' missions. But what we've been focusing on are things like improving decision support systems across our clients' platforms, enabling them to just getting the right information into the decision makers' hands, and enabling that decision making process much faster and much more efficient. Trying to take out errors, trying to increase automation and reliability of that data.
Do you find that your innovations are driven more by your client demands or by Hive anticipating what they will want?
Yeah, I think it's always a mixture of both. I think that, just in our name itself, Hive Group, we've got our people are in the field, our labs are in the field, we're responding to client demand, but we also have this collection of subject matter expertise in-house. All of our leadership are practitioners in the industry, meaning they've delivered solutions to clients themselves. And so when we're brought into discussion with our teams on the delivery side, what we end up doing is synthesizing what they're doing and then using our experience to then pull that information in-house and try to build something on top of that might be useful to the clients, might give some benefit. And not only that, but sharing from what we're doing on one client engagement on other client engagements as well. So we've developed things like Hexacore, which is a delivery excellence framework that we employ in all our delivery teams, and then Hive IQ as well is something else that we've instituted, which is really information sharing and getting best practices from what one team is doing into another team's skill set.
You started to talk about some of your specific products there. It's a crowded federal contracting space. How do you use those kinds of products and other techniques or strategies to differentiate Hive?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's been a lot of innovation in the space, and certainly there's been a lot of top-down pressure, which is really making it a lot of people taking stabs at trying to innovate whether we're building the tools themselves or we're developing partnerships with those that actually have really good tools as well. I mean, it's a mixture between both of those sides of the coin. A lot of what we do is focused around the reinvestment of what we're doing. I mean, we've had a quick and fast growth trajectory since the start of the company, and so what we're doing is taking that money and it's allowing us to reinvest into what we're able to offer as far as our solutions to our clients. That allows us to also get deeper and specialize in some of those areas that we're focusing on.
You talked about that rapid scaling and growth. Are there any particular critical decisions that have enabled you to scale without losing your quality control?
Yes, scaling. Yeah, that is something that, as a practitioner in the field, I think a lot of us don't really get faced with those kinds of questions until you're either in the C-suite or in the ownership seat yourself. And so what we do, I think it's kind of two-part. One is internal. It's making sure that the right people are on the right seats on the bus, because what got you to 50 people isn't necessarily the same configuration that's going to work when you're scaling up to 200. And so you got to keep that in mind. And that's something that you learn when you're actually sitting in that seat. And then the next is externally. I think that you looking at your support providers is a real game changer. Getting the right support providers can be a real force multiplier, and making those mistakes can also cost you a lot of effort and time down the road. And there's certainly some examples of that. One would be getting good advice. Not surprising to anybody, but having good legal advice is a really obvious thing to have. But one that kind of caught me by surprise was banking relationships. And so, when you start out a company, you kind of, whoever give you a line of credit and some treasury is usually who you end up starting with. But as you start to scale up, your needs do change. And so I remember our CFO, Ryan Fuller, came to me and said, hey, I think that's time that we're kind of look at some other options, and got into the why. We ended up going with JP Morgan Chase. Once we did that, I really started realizing how important banking relationships are. Bringing people, hearing from the SMEs on what direction the market is going, getting to meet with other business owners and sort of collaborating with them on what they're going through. All those kinds of those offerings that the right support provider can provide is just, it certainly has affected who we are as a business and how we operate.
That is such important insight, and it sounds like a lesson learned maybe the hard way through experience.
Yeah. There's you can start your QuickBooks is a great tool.
Right.
Probably not going to get you to it's probably not something you want to scale on. But yeah, I mean, the tools that you start out with are great, and they certainly have a place. But the partnerships that they need to evolve along with how you scale.
You also mentioned the importance of having the right people in the right seats on the bus, everybody's favorite leadership analogy. But what are your tricks of the trade in terms of making sure that you have the right people in those right seats, especially in cleared positions, and how do you maintain culture as you're growing your organization?
Yeah, the culture question is we could spend an hour on that alone, and that has certainly faced some challenges with COVID and separation of a lot of folks going remote. But when it comes to talent retention, I think it's one of the most important things that we've focused on. It's important not to just drop your team member off at a client site and say good luck. When our employees look around, what we focus on is putting an emphasis around lifting our people, which is actually one of our core pillars as an organization. And in doing that, we try to focus and work with our client sets on finding opportunities for people to have a growth path. And when we do that, it's more than just a sales pitch. I mean, the employees that are coming in can take a quick look around and see some folks who might have joined our organization at an entry level and are now a part of the leadership team. Finding those kinds of candidates is certainly what we strive for, and that's the kind of culture that we want to build and support. Then there's really a part of the secret sauce is how you hire, which is very different depending on the organizations that you go to. I think that what we try to focus on is more the total picture. I mean, some bigger mistakes that we've seen both on the government side as well as the industry side is making a hiring decision just because the person has done similar work before. Instead of focusing on the culture fit, is this person professionally curious? Are they going to emulate the qualities and the core values that you're trying to establish throughout the organization? And look, nobody bats 1,000 in doing that, but it is something that we consciously try to keep in mind when we're building out our teams.
So we've talked a little bit about what makes Hive different, your scaling strategy, your workforce strategy, but there's a lot that's changing in the GovCon space right now. So if you're looking forward 5 years, how do you think Hive will change to continue to be competitive in the market?
Yeah, so to say that things are changing right now doesn't feel like a strong enough phrase. But one of the things that we want to focus on, and we could go on about all the different kinds of capabilities that we're trying to implement for clients, but one that's near and dear to my heart is certainly the acquisition process. You're seeing a lot in that discussion nowadays, and certainly with the revolutionary FAR overhaul, you're seeing a lot of recommended change for how the government goes about procuring things. So I think that there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen. There's certainly a lot of innovation that we can work towards in that realm. One of the things that we've started at Hive Group is the Industry Partner Council, and that is a collection of really the big 20, and altogether there's 200 businesses all throughout the GovCon space that are in varying degrees participating in it. And what we're aimed to do is really just strengthening that conversation between contracting activities and industry, and trying to find ways to educate each other, break down those barriers, get us talking more. And there's certainly, with as much change that is going on right now, we've got to also keep those avenues to talk and discuss what's working and what's not working. So that's one avenue that we're hoping continues to stick, and certainly getting more contracting activities on board with it.
Will Fortier is CEO of Hive Group, and this has been Government Contractors to Watch, sponsored by J.P. Morgan Chase. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search J.P. Morgan Chase. Still to come, the House clears a key spending package and ACA subsidy extensions. We'll look at what happens next with Mitchell Miller. It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The House has passed the Commerce, Justice, Science minibus, but lawmakers face a packed agenda before the January recess. Appropriators aim to release text for the next bundle, including state, foreign ops, financial services, and homeland security soon, even as DHS funding hangs in the balance after a fatal ICE shooting. We'll also track ACA subsidy talks in the Senate, war power votes brewing on both sides of the Capitol, and how Republicans plan to regroup after their retreat with Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, great to have you back.
Good to be back.
Last week maybe felt like a dog year in terms of congressional activity as Congress came back to town after the holidays. Let's start at the beginning, because the Republicans in the House started their week with a retreat. What did you hear about that, and what's shaping up to be the Republican House strategy?
Well, this was kind of a rally that President Trump, of course, threw out a lot of different ideas. Whether they'll actually become legislation really remains to be seen. But, of course, the big talk is about affordability. And a lot of ideas have been thrown out, but are they going to actually become bills? We'll have to see. A lot of Republicans, frankly, are already kind of getting ready for the post-Trump era, even though we're moving into this second year of President Trump. But the big part of their strategy is definitely going to be selling the Trump tax cuts. They, of course, approved these as part of the big, beautiful bill. And Senate Majority Leader John Thune and other lawmakers went down to the border this past week to stress that. And you're going to see a lot of that from Republicans as they try to get their messaging across while they're dealing with all these other issues like health care in Venezuela, et cetera. That's going to be tough, though, because Democrats also found that difficult. As you remember, when they were trying to do everything related to the Inflation Reduction Act, selling these huge bills that have so many different things in them and actually getting them to resonate with voters before an election, and in this case, before the midterms, it's really difficult.
Well, they're complex and cover so much ground. But in addition to that, the Republican margin has gotten really tight.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, California lawmaker Doug LaMalfa really surprised everybody that he had died at the age of 65 last week, and that brought down the margin in the House to 218 to 213. So you quickly do the math, and that means House Speaker Mike Johnson can only afford to lose 2 votes on any particular piece of legislation. And then there are also a couple of special elections with Democrats likely to pick up 2 seats that are now vacant. So it is going to be a very, very thin margin. I know we've been talking about this for years, but this will be actually the thinnest margin that Speaker Johnson will have, and we saw some of that play out with the legislative action that occurred last week.
Well, let's dig into that, because the first thing, maybe a good news piece, is that the House did pass the first of the minibus appropriation bills. Tell us more.
Right. And related to that thin margin, even that had a little bit of a mini drama on the minibus, because once again, you had conservatives saying that they didn't like some of the earmarks in part of the legislation. So they broke it up, which is kind of rare that they do that even with a minibus. So they basically took commerce, justice, and science, took that as a vote separate from interior, environment, and energy water bills. And they both passed narrowly initially, at least on the rule, and then they easily passed. So that's a big step. As we both know, January 30 is right around the corner, and that's the deadline for when essentially the federal funding will run out and we'll be up against a potential government shutdown. But right now, I'm not hearing a lot about the possibility of a shutdown, because this week they are going to take up another minibus. That one is likely to include Homeland Security, state foreign operations, and financial services. One hiccup in there could be Homeland Security, however. As we all know, a lot of controversy related to the shooting in Minneapolis last week with the ICE officer. And so that could be tripped up a little bit, because a lot of Democrats have concerns about how things are being moved around with Homeland Security. So we'll see if they shift. They could actually potentially instead take up a different minibus. But the Senate, meanwhile, plans to take up the one that was passed last week. So we could get to the point where we're at least halfway through the 12 appropriations bills that need to be passed by the 30th, which in congressional terms, that's a lot of progress.
These minibuses are sort of ordered in degree of difficulty, aren't they? So getting the CJS and interior bill through is one step. The next one's a little harder. The last one is defense and some other big topics.
Yeah, that's a great point. That literally is how it works. You know, they work through the easiest things first and leave the hardest ones for last. And definitely defense, labor, health and human services, and education, that is going to be the toughest one. And that's going to be the one that probably pushes us right toward that January 30th deadline, because they know that they just can't get agreements right away on these things. But Tom Cole, one of the top appropriators on the Republican side in the House, he increasingly, though, sounds pretty confident that they're going to just keep cutting away at this and making sure that they get through these appropriations. By the way, just a little bit of detail on the environmental and interior bill. The cuts that were made were actually much less than what the Trump administration wanted. For example, the EPA would be cut by $320 million. That compares to $4 billion that the administration had sought. And then the National Park Service would go down a much lower level than the almost 40% cut that the White House had sought.
I'm speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's the Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. All right, Mitchell, we're going to take the good news there and run with it, and we'll tackle a different topic, because the House also made some surprising progress on the ACA subsidies vote.
Right. This was something that a lot of people were really skeptical about at the end of the last year, as you know, whether or not they would actually get this vote. But the discharge petition went ahead. You had 4 Republicans joining Democrats to get that to the floor, much to the chagrin of House Speaker Mike Johnson. And it did pass. And in fact, it passed easier than expected, with 17 Republicans joining Democrats to get this 3-year extension passed. That shows that there is some nervousness among the GOP about health care costs as we talk about moving toward the midterm elections. Now, this bill will not pass in the Senate. However, it does show that there is momentum for some type of health care legislation. And what the talk is right now, and there's been some very encouraging developments on the Senate side, is that they, on a bipartisan basis, could potentially get an extension of the ACA, perhaps maybe 2 years. And then they're also talking about extending open enrollment to March 1st. And then there will be a variety of reforms, potentially, that Republicans have been pushing for: a new income eligibility cap, a minimum monthly premium, and then potentially stiffer fines for insurance companies that sign people up without their consent, essentially going after fraud. So I think we are going to continue to see progress on this front. So another piece of good news.
Maybe a little silver lining to the shutdown. The other big topic this past week was operations in Venezuela and the interest that generated around war powers resolutions.
Yeah, this has been a pet project of Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine for a long time, and he really kind of outdid himself this time around. Last time this came up to limit any kind of military action that the president could take against Venezuela without the consent of Congress. It did not move forward. It only got 2 Republicans. This time, it got the Republicans it needed to move forward. It got 5 Republicans. President Trump made it very clear he did not like that. He singled out all of those Republicans, saying they should not be reelected. But what this did was moved forward this legislation, so it will likely be discussed again this week before a final vote. We're not sure exactly when that'll take place, but they'll do a vote-a-rama where lawmakers will have a chance to add a lot of amendments to this. But this is pretty significant given all the support that the president has had initially, at least, related to Venezuela on the Republican side. The fact that Congress is starting to assert itself a little bit more in connection with the War Powers Act, so we'll have to see where that goes.
We also heard that Ruben Gallego may be teeing up a War Powers Act on Greenland.
That was really interesting because amid all the discussion related to Venezuela last week, Greenland was just popping up all over. And who would have thought that would be on your bingo card a few years ago? But clearly there is concern among Congress, members of Congress, about what is going to happen with Greenland. And the Arizona Senator Ruben Gallego, as you mentioned, his War Powers Act would essentially say that the president could not take any military action to take Greenland if he so desired. Now, the administration has had kind of a set of conflicting pieces of information related to Greenland. The president wanting to keep pumping up the potential threat. A lot of other members of the administration and some Republicans in Congress saying, wait a second, no, there's no way that there's ever going to be military action. But there is serious talk about some kind of negotiations or purchase. And by the way, if Greenland were somehow to be bought by the United States, that funding would have to come from Congress. Or if there were some kind of deal that was cut with Denmark, which of course controls Greenland, then there would have to be a 2/3 majority of the Senate to approve a new treaty, and those usually take quite a while. So I think this may actually be something percolating, obviously, in connection with what happened in Venezuela. We'll just have to see where that goes.
You're absolutely right. I did not have Greenland on my bingo card. One other thing, and this is a topic you and I have talked about, and I know you're watching, is retirements from Congress. And this week, Steny Hoyer announced that he's going to retire. What does that mean for the leadership positions in the House?
Well, this is really interesting because Steny Hoyer is just one of those lawmakers who has seemingly been around forever, and he has been in Congress now for 45 years, longest serving member from Maryland ever. And this really signifies the changing of the guard in the U.S. House of Representatives, at least on the Democratic side, because for 20 years, Steny Hoyer was part of the Democratic leadership. He was the number 2 under House Speaker Nancy Pelosi when she was the Speaker, much to his chagrin because he wanted to be Speaker at one point. But at any rate, he was the House Majority Leader twice during his tenure. But now they are moving on the Democratic side to a much more younger leadership in the waiting, if you will, if they are able to retake the House. The Democrats still remain pretty bullish on the fact that they might be able to do that because of gerrymandering and all the things related to redistricting. There's not really probably going to be another wave type election for either side moving forward. But Democrats, if they picked up the seats, then you're looking at somebody like Hakeem Jeffries, who's been the House Minority Leader now for a while. He has the backing of Steny Hoyer and some of the old guard, if you will, of the Democratic Party. But you have more than 40 members of the House who are leaving to either run for other office or to retire. In this case, Steny Hoyer is not leaving because obviously he wants to go to another job. He's 86 years old, or necessarily because he's so bitter about the way things are in the House. He just feels that he has had an incredible legislative career, which is no question about it. This is a person who is respected on both sides of the aisle. In fact, former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy actually issued a nice statement related to Steny Hoyer. So it was good to see a little bit of bipartisanship. I'll leave you with this little anecdote, with all the acrimony here on the Hill. But when he gave his final floor speech, the current House Speaker, Steve Scalise, and the whip, Tom Emmer, on the Republican side, were both there on the floor and personally congratulated him. So it's nice to see a little bit of bipartisanship here and there on the House floor.
Well, that seems like a good place to leave it. We've covered a lot of ground. Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thank you so much, as always.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Emergency Management Agency started off the new year by not renewing appointments for 50 disaster management staff. That cut is sparking concerns about potential FEMA plans for deeper staff reductions. For more on the situation, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, great to have you.
Hey, Terry, thanks for having me.
Fill us in on the details here. 50 people doesn't seem like a big cut, but it's also important. So who were those folks and what did they do?
Right. Well, these were 50 people who were a part of FEMA's cadre of on-call response/recovery employees, CORE for short. And these CORE employees are hired for 2 to 4 year terms, but they're often renewed to continue ongoing disaster work. And CORE staff make up the majority of FEMA's permanent workforce, about 40% as of 2022. So these 50 staff were cut because their terms ended between January 1st and January 4th of this year, and they were not renewed. And FEMA staff, FEMA supervisors who I spoke to, both past and present, said that it's highly unusual. It doesn't happen prior to this for these staff to be cut just because their terms end between January 1st and January 4th. It's often done on a case-by-case basis where there will be an analysis of each person who's up for renewal to see what their workload has been and what it will be in the future. So these cuts, while it's about 50 out of 8,000, are sparking some concerns that there could be more in the future.
Is it that people are concerned that this is a new model and whenever their term might be up, these CORE folks may be let go?
Well, that's the thing. There's a new CORE renewal process that's been happening behind the scenes. In December, FEMA headquarters gave a directive to all FEMA regions and directorates that they would have to submit justification packages for every CORE staff who is up for renewal in January. We don't know exactly how many that could be, but it could be in the hundreds. And following this justification package submission period, these CORE staff who were up for renewal between January 1st and January 4th were then all not renewed. And so that's naturally led to questions about what will happen to the rest of the people who are up for renewal through the remainder of January. A FEMA supervisor who I spoke to just last week said that they have since received directive to submit justification packages for people who are up for renewal in February. So how long this will go on, how many people will not be renewed is a big question. The folks who I spoke to said that CORE renewal, people who are on CORE are almost always renewed if they want to continue with the agency because there is just so much disaster management work to go around. They are staffing, not just the next disaster, but these months and year-long recoveries that happen in these disaster recovery centers that spring up and stick around in places like North Carolina for the last year. And so there's a question of how deep will these CORE cuts go, and then the work isn't going away, so who will do it and how will FEMA spread it around?
Is it possible that folks who were supposed to submit these justifications maybe just missed the memo over the holidays and didn't get their packages submitted?
I've heard that those renewal justification packages did go up to FEMA headquarters, and it's not clear who exactly reviewed them, but it doesn't appear that they were taken on a case-by-case basis, and that still those who fell in the January 1st to January 4th period, regardless of what was in their justification package, was let go. There's also a question as to whether the Department of Homeland Security and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem now have more control over FEMA CORE renewals, because it was directed that these justification packages be organized such that they could be reviewed by the Homeland Security Secretary again, it's not clear that actually happened. And so there's just a great deal of uncertainty about what happens next with the core staff as these renewals naturally just come up over the next days and weeks.
The president has continued to say he'd like to get rid of FEMA. Do we have a sense at this point yet what the administration's long-term plan for the agency is?
In a word, no. We know that they have put out statements of intent, like the one you just referenced. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has frequently said that the FEMA needs to go away in the capacity that it exists today and be totally reformed. They've said they wanted to shift more responsibilities to state and local governments. But the FEMA Review Council was set to put out recommendations late last month that would have detailed what these reforms would look like. And that final meeting was canceled at the last minute by the White House. And it's unclear whether they're going to move forward with that or what's going to happen next with the long-term vision for FEMA. One thing that also came out in emails that I've obtained and several other news outlets have obtained, last month, FEMA's Chief Human Capital Office put together a workforce capacity planning exercise that included draft target reductions for fiscal 2026, contemplating a 50% overall reduction to FEMA's total workforce of 23,000 people. Now, the emails state that the exercise is pre-decisional in nature and that no staffing actions or personnel decisions are being directed as part of it. But, of course, current and former FEMA staff, are saying that it would be highly unusual to conduct such an exercise without some sort of idea for future cuts to happen.
The 2026 appropriations for DHS are still on the Hill, probably part of another minibus package that we might see later in the month. Are you hearing any congressional response to these latest cuts around FEMA and whether or not they might play out in appropriations language?
Well, these latest FEMA core cuts have come under some criticism from congressional Democrats. House Homeland Security Committee Ranking Member Benny Thompson has put out a statement calling them reckless. He calls the 50% cut that was contemplated in that exercise reckless. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Ranking Member Rick Larson is leading one of the leaders of a bill to actually make FEMA an independent agency. And this is a bipartisan bill that has, both Republicans and Democrats signed on to it. It remains to be seen whether that will move forward on the House floor. But Rick Larson has also criticized these recent cuts. And the appropriations package that both the Senate and the House lawmakers have agreed to for DHS, this is a Republican package, would actually require FEMA to basically maintain staffing levels consistent with their mission. So kind of a statement in that bill to not cut too deeply into FEMA, because that's the big concern here is that, yes, the Trump administration has a new vision for FEMA to downsize it, streamline it, and shift more responsibilities to the states, but nothing has changed as far as the disasters that FEMA is managing today and the ones that it would have to manage should they happen in the future. And there's a concern that these cuts could go too deep before a lot of this reform work has even played out.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for joining me. We'll continue to keep our eye on this issue.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.